Welcome to the National Press Foundation. I'm Sonni, NPF's president. Today we're talking about the supply chain snafus that are roiling the global economy and what journalists need to watch for in 2022. Our three panelists are all on the West Coast, so please join me in thanking them for getting up super early to help you file great stories. This is the first of 6 webinars that the National Press Foundation will be offering this year on global trade issues for journalists. The next program will be March 16th with the Wall Street Journal reporters who won the Heinrich Award for International Trade Reporting. They'll talk about how China is reshaping the international norms and standards that affect global trade while the US has been otherwise engaged. And I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Heinrich Foundation, for this program and also for helping us to bring 20 reporters to Singapore in July of this year. We'll be running an in-person training on Asian trade issues. So look out for the application, which will be open for that fellowship soon. Our first speaker is Philip Levy, chief economist at Flexport, a global logistics platform based in San Francisco. Under President George W. Bush, he served as the senior economist for trade for the President's Council of Economic Advisors. And before that, he was on the policy planning staff at the State Department. Next up will be Edwin Lopez, a senior editor at Supply Chain Dive. Edwin spends his days trying to make trade stories better, and he's going to share his tips with you. And finally, we have Danny Romero from Yahoo Finance, who's been covering the port story from Los Angeles. She was down at the ports this weekend, and she will give you the latest from the ground. Now, as you know, the supply chain snafu has been blamed most recently for the shortages of everything from COVID-19 test kits and baby formula. I'm sure there are shortages in your coverage area. So please don't wait until the end of this program to ask questions about what's going on and that are relevant to your stories. You can raise your Zoom hands or drop questions in the Q&A as we go. As always, we're on the record. We'll be posting an interactive transcript tomorrow or Friday. But if anybody needs quotes sooner, please let us know and we'll share the recording. And with that, Philip, over to you. Tell us what's going on in this big, sprawling, crazy story.
I will. Thank you, Sonni. I'll do my best. I'm going to try to share a screen here. Hopefully, all the technology is going to behave. I couldn't decide whether to call this logistics under pressure or I buried the lead. See if you can find it. But I decided to go with logistics under pressure because the latter will happen anyways. You guys, all your inner editors will come out. You can figure out. But what I'm going to suggest is there's a couple puzzles here that we want to think about. I'm coming at this from an economic perspective. So one puzzle is, how did we go from a sharp recession to a goods crunch? Those two things seem kind of antithetical. How did that happen? And then the second puzzle, which actually I would suggest that many people have gotten wrong, the answer to this one is closely related. Wait, why was this a crunch at all? Okay, fine, demand moved a little bit. Usually the economy just adjusts and you get the goods anyways. Why did this turn into this thing where you've got inflation and delays and the like? And actually, how do we even characterize that? How do we know how bad it is? How will we know when it even stops? What can you put in your stories? I'll try to point to some data as we go. All right, so let me start with what might be the obvious, which is we had this very, very sharp recession with the onset of the pandemic. That's a big drop. It's also a very fast recovery. Why is that relevant for what we're talking about? Because a lot of what you're seeing with supply chains and the way businesses react, it has to do with expectations and people making plans in advance. So when people saw this recession coming on, and for those who aren't used to it with this kind of data, that vertical gray bar is the recession period. They said, I get it. It's a recession. I know how recessions work. Everything slows down. People have less money in their pockets. They buy less goods. They ship fewer things. And I'm going to, react to that in advance. I'm not going to get caught out. So I'm going to cancel sailings. I might, lay off some people or at least not hire as I thought to, because I don't want to get caught on the wrong side of this. The rapidity of the rebound, therefore, caught these people a little bit more than it otherwise would have. Other thing to note on this is if you look at where we were for GDP pre-recession, it took roughly a year to kind of get back to where we had started, right? If you go from sort of Q1 2020 to Q1 2021, we're just eyeballing here, roughly a year to get back. All right, let's look at trade. And I did this slightly differently because you have to start looking at adjusting for inflation now. So I did adjust this, but you can see in the sort of spring of 2020 when you have the same gap. But oh, look at this. This is quite different. For imports, how long did it take us to get back to where we were pre-dip? It took almost no time at all. By the summer of 2020, we were already there. You had a much quicker recovery in imports. And then things shot up so that we've been steadily doing more and more and more. I will take this as a partial answer to one of the questions that I posed, which is, if you want to say that there's two big theories that you hear put about, nobody calls them a theory, but people will put forward as assertions for what caused all this. One of these is I call it the sort of who forgot to flip the switch story, which is there was something wrong with supply chains. They didn't work the way they were supposed to. And if only somebody would go down in the basement with a flashlight, find the switch, flip the switch, we'd get them operating again, and we'll get back to where we were supposed to be. That's why I'm showing you this graph, because I don't buy that. I go with the other story, which is you had a really unusual surge in demand. And the way we can tell the difference is if it were really the who forgot to flip the switch story, the way this graph would look is you would sort of gradually make your way back to where you once were, and you just have recovered. That's not where we are. I actually did the calculations earlier. I'm not reading this off the graph, but the latest December numbers, or the latest numbers they were just released this week, you had US imports, I think it was just shy of 20%. It was 19.7% above where they were in February 2020 in real terms. That's a lot of stuff coming in. This is not that the supply chain failed to move stuff. It couldn't keep up. So what was it having to keep up with? So this thing, which might take a little bit of explaining, and don't worry about all the stuff at the top. I'll say what that is in a second in terms of the variables. Really, this is the top line is real personal income. The red line is real government transfers to people. The green line is real savings. So all the 100 times stuff, that's just me making it real as opposed to nominal, which is starting to matter a lot as we're getting inflation going. You can get different stories if you don't account for inflation. So remember I said the thing that we all thought we knew heading into a recession was incomes will go down and people will spend less. So look at this top line here, the blue line. Incomes didn't go down. Incomes, in fact, never got back down to where they were right on the eve of the pandemic in the US. And in fact, at various points, they shot up significantly. So why did this happen? Well, we know why this happened. This was things like the CARES Act and the American Recovery Act and so forth, but it was putting money in people's pockets, and that had an effect. So that first bit of how much do you have to spend, we didn't see what we thought we'd see. We didn't see this thing dipping way down and then coming back. I will note that some of the stuff you'll see later, where you get these little spikes, it correlates pretty well with some of the consumption spikes we've had. Note how off to the right, as you get past, say, May of 21, there's not a lot of activity. Things kind of coast down. In other words, we're not getting that sort of goosing of the economy that we were getting earlier. And that may let us draw some conclusions about what comes next. All right, so here, this is, I think, a interesting explanation of what's going on. So this looks at the report on what do people buy? So personal consumption expenditures. And personal consumption expenditures are broken into three categories: services, durable goods, and non-durable goods, where durable is goods that last 3 years or more. What I've done here, they're actually not all on a par with each other. Services are about 70% of consumption, non-durables are about 20%, and durables are about 10%. But what I've done here is to try and make for easy comparison, I want to do a couple points. I've sort of normalized this so that February of 2020 equals 100. So you can easily read off what are the percentage changes from where we were on the eve of the pandemic. First thing I want you to note, though, is look how boring this graph is to the left of that February 2020. These things didn't move much in relation to each other, right? This was pretty constant. So if you think about sort of how people operated, you were seeing little wiggles, but not big swings, right? It was dull if you measured it this way. And then look what happens. So what happens here, initially, during the gray bar with the onset of the recession around March or April of 2020, you start seeing the kind of behavior you would have thought, right? Everything, I guess there's a little blip up in non-durables as we all bought our toilet paper, but then it all goes down, right? Everything goes down. And that's what we would have thought. It's going to go down. It's a recession. And in fact, if you want to look at what we would have expected coming off a recession, the green services line pretty much shows it. If you just looked at services, that's pretty normal, right? You take a steep drop and gradually you work your way back. And we're probably now I haven't seen the exact number, but just about where we were pre-recession. There, if everything looked like that, this would have been normal. But look at the other two, and especially look at durables, the red line. After this initial drop, this goes shooting up. And it goes shooting up to the point where by the time you get to March or April of 21, we're consuming 35% more than we were on the eve of the pandemic of durables. So this is sofas and ovens and all these things and exercise bikes and all this stuff that lasts. That's a lot, and that's what's putting strain on us. Now, also note that backs off towards the end. And one of the Fed's big theories was, hey, if you shift forward all that consumption at some point, you'll have used up all your need for sofas and ovens, and you'll stop buying them. But then you also know that non-durables start creeping up. Well, not just creeping up, they only look minimal because in comparison to durables. By the time you get even to July of 2020, you're about 5% more consuming non-durables than you were pre-pandemic. And by the time you're in the spring, you're, 12, 15% more. Remember, the norm was what we saw before, which is these things don't move very much. These are dramatic upward moves. People did a lot more consuming of goods. All right, so what's going on with all this? Why are people doing this? I think there's two things that feed into the consumption of goods. One of it is how much money in the pocket. We looked at that earlier. And then there's just simply this matter of preferences. And this is capturing what you saw in the previous graph. And it's looking to say, all right, let's take sort of 0% as the norm. That's what we had, that sort of flat line pre-COVID. How far off are people in terms of their tilt from services to goods? And that's bundling durables and non-durables together. And I picked 100 because I was kind of optimistic. I thought, okay, this is summer of 2020. That's the new norm. You see it kind of flat lines there on 100%. Clearly, we're going to drop right back from there to zero again. It's just a question of when. I was wrong. Didn't happen. We instead shot up. The shooting up, you'll note, coincided with some of the money being infused in these acts. Look at the spring of 21. We can go back at some point and look at the slides. Okay, why am I doing this with two lines, not just one? The green line here is the actual data put out by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Is based on their personal consumption expenditure release. The red line is Flexport's estimate, where we take this data, we mix in Flexport shipping data and come up with the best estimate we can. And you'll note that it goes farther than the green data because we go several months in advance. Unfortunately, we're still a week shy of our next releases. We release this monthly. You can find this on our website at flexport.com/research, but we're putting out regularly what's our estimate of what comes next. I'll give you a little preview, which is things are going to turn down a bit. But before I say that, let me just note, I've been talking about all this stuff as US data. Obviously, we're interested in the rest of the world, not just the US. How much was this a purely US phenomenon? The answer is, it really wasn't a purely US phenomenon. In fact, the US wasn't even the extreme. The UK was the extreme. This is the same kind of thing, looking at the shift towards goods and away from services. So the green line shows the UK, the red line shows the US. Note, by the way, this stops a little earlier. This is not one of our regularly scheduled releases. This was some research that we had done a while back. The black line, though, is the average of 25 countries tracked by the OECD. And so what you'll see is you have this throughout, and it's not a huge puzzle as to why. If you can't go out on travel to hotels, and you can't go to restaurants, and you can't go to the gym, you start consuming goods instead. And that was a not completely universal phenomenon, but pretty widespread. So this is solving part of our puzzle for where all that demand came from. All right, this is a sneak preview. This is something I'm going to be writing about, but I think it's a story that bears watching. And this is, I know this sometimes seems like a really esoteric economist thing about whether we're talking about nominal or real, where nominal is the numbers that people put forward and real is when you adjust for inflation. Here's me preaching a little bit. It matters, and it matters more as we're getting into times of high inflation. And it's not just that it's high inflation that's affecting different sectors differently. So here's what this graph does. It's looking at the same kind of shape that you saw earlier. The red lines are the ones you want to focus on. Blue is talking about services, red is talking about goods. And it's telling that same story, But you'll see that unlike that earlier PCI thing that I showed, this has a pretty sharp downturn at the end. And in fact, the dotted red line has a fairly striking downturn at the end. So two things are different here. One, this includes the data that was released 2 weeks ago, which the other one didn't. And we did start to see a downturn. The other thing is that the dotted line adjusts for the particularly high inflation that we've seen in the goods sector. So if you start talking about this in real terms, and I think that's what we want here, because we're talking about how many goods move through ports, for example, not the value of goods moving through ports. What you see is the numbers may have been a bit inflated. We might be seeing a turn. If you look at this graph and you say, well, wait a second, let's not buy the head fake. We've seen stuff like this before, right? You look back at December of 2020, there was a downturn that actually looked a fair bit like this. How do we know that this downturn now won't be followed by another spike, just like we had last spring? Well, we don't know it for a fact, but the thing that we sort of do know is that other one was accompanied by a big infusion of money into people's pockets, and we're not seeing that this time. So that's one reason to think that this is different. All right.
Phil, sorry to interrupt, but your camera seems to have gone off. Are you able to turn it back on?
Maybe.
Okay.
I don't know.
Good luck with that.
It actually shows that it's still on. Not sure. I will try to revive it in a second, but I don't know what that has to do with the screen sharing here. Maybe it's because it wasn't showing something. You still know what I look like when I'm animated, jumping up and down and talking economics. So we'll get there. What I wanted to do was, the question that one often gets, and the different people have different measures, but I like ours, is, so wait, how bad is this crisis? When is it going to turn? How are we going to even know when it turns? What do we watch? Well, you watch Flexport, of course. We put together here, and unlike some competitors who only have 4 months of data, we go all the way back to 2019. And so what you can see is, to about a year before the onset. And what we're measuring here is something very, very simple. How many days does it take to get cargo from the time it's ready to leave the factory, cargo ready date, to when it's picked up from its destination port? Somebody gets it from LA Long Beach, for example, or from Amsterdam. So what we do is we have two different lines here. One of these, in trade, you tend to talk about these things in terms of trade lanes. The Trans-Pacific eastbound basically just translates as Asia to North America. The Far East westbound is Asia to Europe. So these are the two biggest trade lanes in the world. And what we've seen is, how long does it take to move something through? Now, this is not just the ships on the ocean. This may be getting things through ports on one side and ports on the other side. So it's a more holistic view of this. The headline from this is, if you were looking for the US, for example, you were talking about the 40 to 50 day range in 2019. That's about how long you'd expect to go from cargo ready to destination port pickup. What are you talking about now? We put this out weekly, by the way. This is also on our website. Now you're talking about 110 days. So it's, I think that's one of the more useful measures we have of the scale of the crisis. What has this all meant as we've had this huge crunch? The other thing I would note about this graph, just to warn you as you write stories, is it is not, and forgive me for a slight bit of jargon here, it is not monotonic. It is not like it always goes up, always and forever. If you look, it has some whole sections where it swoons downward, and then it goes up again. In fact, it's not random when that happens. It tends to happen in the spring, which we haven't sort of investigated as full as we like, but this may be sort of after effects of things like the Lunar New Year celebration. So that's going to be an ongoing question, which is, if it'd be a little bit surprising if we don't see a downturn in these times. If we see a downturn that then continues and keeps dropping down until we get to the 40 to 50 range on the Trans-Pacific eastbound, then we say, aha, we've more or less recovered from this. If we see something where it kind of plateaus and then stays at a level, then the crisis continues. Last thing I would note on this particular graph, again, I've sort of tended to neglect the rest of the world a bit, but you can see that this is not a purely US problem. Getting goods from Asia to Europe is about the same. In percentage terms, it hasn't slowed as much, since it used to be longer, and now they've more or less equalized. That equalization is also companies moving their stuff around to sort of put ships where they're most needed. All right, we can come back to that if anybody wants. I'll close with, I've gone on for a long time. I'll close with a few stories to follow. You've seen what happens after income support. How are people able to buy things? How are they affording them? We know some of what's getting stuffed into people's pockets, but it's great to get out on the ground and sort of ask, what are people doing? I've stressed several times inflation distortions. Be careful with numbers now that we've gone through a couple of decades where you could safely ignore them. You can't anymore. The other thing I'll sort of note is there's a real tendency in all this to talk about the supply chain problem, which covers up and I think conceals more than it reveals. That in fact, that can be, how are factories working at one end? What's happening in terms of transport from the factory to the origin port? How are the ships moving? Can you get space on a ship or do you get rolled? What's happening at the unloading at another port? How are they handling containers? How is trucking working? How is warehousing working? And what we've seen across this pandemic is that it's often been shifts where one sector will have trouble just as another recovers, but it all sort of wraps up into these delays that we noted earlier. And then, of course, there's some very interesting questions about how people are reacting to this and are businesses moving their supply chains around. So I will close there. Thank you for your patience and attention. Although I can't actually see whether anybody stayed, but you can find this stuff, a lot of this at flexport.com/research.
Phil, thanks so much for that fantastic briefing. Journalists, the slides that Phil showed you are free and available on that website. Phil, let me just ask you a quick question about Russia, Ukraine, since it's much in the news right now. Yeah. Can you talk? We're not talking about the oil problems or the gold market, but just in terms of the supply chain, what effects would you anticipate if Russia moves to invade Ukraine?
Yeah, so I think you make a very good point, which I think we should distinguish between sort of direct effects and indirect effects. There are some direct effects. Russia is linked into supply chains to a limited extent. You have them sort of supplying food, supplying energy. They're nowhere near as tightly linked in as, say, a country like China. So this does not go hand in hand with geopolitical significance. Where do things come in as direct effects? Overflights, that the vast majority of goods move by ocean, but some do move by air. Air has been a means of getting around supply chain problems. If your factory was going to shut because you don't have a key part, you might fly in that key part. If you had tensions of the sort, I don't know whether we will, where you had difficulty flying over Russia and the Ukraine, that can make for difficulties in terms of, that would be the normal route you would take from Asia to Europe. That would go over those places. So that's the direct stuff. Then there's indirect on what does this do to people's confidence? What does this do as it works through various supply chains? Can they fix the energy stuff? But the biggest direct thing, I think, is the overflights.
And what industries will most be affected if overflights are disrupted?
Well, the traditional users, the heavy users of air, are things like electronics and fast fashion. So this has changed a little bit as ocean has gotten stymied. So there may have been more companies that got into it. But you even get things like automotive sectors who will occasionally do this when they have key parts. But the two that leap right to mind would be electronics and fast fashion.
Okay, two good stories to follow. Thank you. So let me turn this over to Edwin Lopez to talk about how this looks from the reporter's point of view and how we can all do better.
Yeah, thanks, Sonni, and thanks, Phil, for that briefing. It was very informative. When I was asked to join this, I was really focusing on what tips can I give a reporter who may not have covered supply chain before this entire environment and crisis, who might be just digging in also that might want to go deeper. So I think I can summarize my advice into 4 distinct tips. The first one actually touches on something that Phil just said, which is I would recommend, not necessarily in copy, but just as you think of a story, to avoid the word shortages. Because as I think Phil insinuated, if you focus on that word and you are content to say there is a shortage of toilet paper, you will miss deeper, more important stories, such as People are buying more toilet paper. The truck didn't arrive that was carrying that toilet paper, et cetera, et cetera. And to emphasize this, a single shortage, that end result, which is a good is not on a shelf or in stock online, can result for a wide array of different things. It might have been a truck or a ship that was delayed. It might have been the store manager did not buy enough or did not tell their corporate headquarters to send them enough of the goods because they didn't anticipate the demand was going up. Could have been the manufacturer was not able to produce enough goods in time to keep up with demand. Or it could have been that when the truck got to the store was so full that they sent the truck back because they had an oversupply of goods in the store. So as you can see, there's a lot of different reasons that a good might not be in stock. And I think we're at the point where after having covered supply chain shortages for 6 months, it's time to go a little bit deeper. And there are more than enough of those stories to tell. We just have to ask ourselves the right question on how to tell them. Which brings me to my next piece of advice, which is that when I think of the supply chain, it's really important to remember the people. So my advice would be to think of these stories not as product stories, not as the story about toilet paper, but a story about leadership, right? There are really, really, really incredible stories of people going above and beyond to react to the crazy numbers that Phil just showed you, right? There are stories of that truck driver that really went out of their way because they wanted to get that shipment into the store at the right time. There are stories about that supply chain manager in the corporate headquarters or in the retail or grocery store that had a hunch that demand was going to go up, right? And so they made an unpopular decision that during a recession to keep goods in stock. So sometimes what is in store is as important as what's not in store because of those leadership decisions, right? And more importantly, I think you should be looking at when you see a shortage or a lack thereof, going to the store, to the business, to the manufacturing headquarters in your town and asking them, hey, we all know the supply chain's an issue. How are you adapting? How are you hurting, right? These people are doing their best to be resilient in these trying times. And that's really interesting, not just to a business audience, but I think to a broader audience as well. My third tip is related for that because I see a lot of these stories, and particularly from people that are kind of entering the space and covering supply chains is you will see a lot of investment in different things during this time, particularly new facilities. Everywhere you look, I can look outside my window right now and there's a new warehouse going up just around the corner from my place, right? And there's a script, particularly, if you're a local reporter, you're probably used to writing these stories. X company bought Y facility or is building Y facility. Here's who they're working with. Here's how much money is pouring in. Done, right? But if you want to go deeper, this is a really good opportunity to go deeper because every new facility that is invested or that changes hands has a story. Again, touching on the question that Phil just said right now is, how are supply chains adjusting? How are companies moving their operations? Every new warehouse that goes up gives you a hint to that story. And likely you can talk to that warehouse manager, to that building company, and they have an answer. All you have to do is ask, right? And they might tell you, oh, hey, we decided that in addition to our manufacturing plant in Vietnam, we also wanted to have a manufacturing presence in the United States. So that when something goes wrong over there, we can order production here. And so you might find these stories. We just need to be more proactive about asking those questions when we see the little hints and pieces of the puzzle pop up. Which leads me to my last piece of advice, especially for people that might not already be covering it, but are considering covering supply chains, is there are more than enough stories to tell in this time about the supply chain, and not nearly enough people to cover them. I say this because, in my publication, we only write about supply chain, right? And yeah, it'd be great if we could cover all the news, but the truth is we can't. And so I want to read the stories that you write. I want to read that local story that has really, really good analysis of why that one facility is connected to the broader trends in the world, right? And I wanna read them and I wanna share them with the supply chain readers that I have. because there are stories to tell, and I'm glad that everyone is here, thinking about how to tell them, because it's really important. That's all my prepared stuff. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any, Sonni.
Oh, thanks so much for those wonderful tips. So anybody that wants to ask questions, please go ahead and raise your Zoom hands. We'll call on you, or just put your question in the Q&A. And I'll interrupt Danny if any great questions come in. But Danny, let me turn it over to you. First of all, before the program started, Danny was getting a lot of props for actually preparing for this webinar by going down to the port and seeing for herself what was going on. And Danny's bilingual, interviewing people both in English and Spanish to find out what is actually happening down there. So Danny, over to you.
Yeah, I think Edwin kind of hammered home a lot of the things that, shout out to local news, because I was a local news reporter. And so before I got to Yahoo, and I will say that those local news stories, that's where it starts and that's how it grows, right? And it impacts other businesses. And, going off of the shortage, I think that word, we heard it so often for months, right? We heard trucking shortage, there's not enough truck drivers, supplies and things like that. And even with Phil Levy's, his graphs that he showed us, you could see that, right? You can see how that really played out. And so for me, I was like, is there really a shortage? Is that really what's going on? And so I went out to the ports in around October and spoke with longshoremen. They live around the neighborhood. They live in the neighborhoods, near the ports. And so you can find them, going to the grocery store, you just talk to them, you ask them questions, and I also went to gas stations to talk to truck drivers. And a lot of them are, they're not part of associations. So when you hear a trucking association say there is a shortage, maybe they're not including that other truck driver that maybe isn't, that is a contractor. And that was something I learned. I didn't know that. I didn't know that truck drivers could be contractors. And so that kind of told the story there too. So just being on the ground, asking those questions, getting involved in the community is so huge. I think that is, like Edwin hammered that home, because that's where the stories really start from. And so I just went back there, back to the ports over the weekend and spoke with truck drivers. And yes, there is some easing. I would say, like Phil said in his message, there is a little bit of that downturn that you can see in the graph. But there's still more that, truck drivers are feeling. And another side that I had learned was that some truck drivers, they spend hours waiting to get inside the port. And I asked them, I go, what's the reasoning? What's going on? And they said it's because, this is according to these truck drivers I spoke with, their business isn't paying the fees to get their container out. And so there's that, right? I didn't realize that. I didn't know that plays a big role. And that's separate to other fees, right? There's a dwelling fee container that was started a few months back. But there's that aspect, right? That was something that the truck drivers are saying. I spend 5 hours and sometimes I don't even leave. And it's not because something with the port, it's that their business hasn't paid that fee. And so I talked to longshoremen, another thing, men and women. And they said to me, they gave me a little update on volume. There's a lot of volume. They say that they are working really hard right now. And I asked them about that fee, the container dwell fee, which is something that the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach have announced. They haven't really started it. They keep pushing it off. And I asked them, I go, why do you think that's necessary? Do you think that we need to be charging businesses a fee for them to have their containers at the port if they're extended for a certain amount of time? And the longshore woman that I spoke with said, yeah, I think that we need to be starting those fees that have been pushed back for a while. And so another thing that was very interesting is I asked them about the 24 hours, right? We had the Biden administration saying that the ports would be operating 24 hours. Well, I asked them about that. I go, is that something that's playing a big role in what's going on? And they said that certain terminals they operate 24 hours, but other terminals do not. And so, and it's also a case by case scenario. Now, this is all from longshoremen that work at the ports. And so they're telling me, this and that, as much as we like to hear the news, saying, oh, the ports are open 24 hours relatively, is that, the big picture? I'm getting that that's not. So, that's an update there as well. I also went out and took some pictures and wanted to see can we see the cargo ships, the backlog? Is that something we still see? And I didn't see that. I took some pictures. You can't even see any of the ships out there. You see some cute little sailboats, but nothing, none of those big cargo ships. And so that's something that was definitely an update in regards to that. But another thing I wanted to mention is I did speak with small business owners in the area, and they are still feeling the supply chain impacts. Yes, I think there's someone, Phil wanted to make a comment.
Phil, back to you.
Oh, I did. I didn't want to cut you off because part of what I was going to comment on was to heartily endorse both what you and Edwin were saying and to sort of elaborate on this. On what Danny just said, I think it enormously important. And on a lot of these things, the details matter. So you talk about the fees, for example, who actually pays that fee, right? Where will this be a shipping company that ends up paying this? Will this end up being passed on to a client? How is that going to work? These things aren't necessarily obvious. You assume that it goes to the person it's initially handed to. Is that really how it works, or does it get passed on? There's questions like, what's happening to truckers' incentives? I'm an economist. We always think about incentives, right? No, but you get a difference between, is a trucker paid by the hour or by the container? If you're paid by the container, and then you have to wait in line a long time to get a container, does that mean that your pay is actually going down as things are getting busier? So a hearty endorsement of what Danny was saying, because I think the details really matter on this stuff. And this is where reporting can really help actually solve the puzzle. On what Edwin talked about, also very, very important, and I want to pick up on a particular thing. He made the point, which was, hey, each of these investments is a story. Absolutely right. Part of that story, and what I would encourage you to ask about, is there are assumptions that underlie all those investments. And the challenging thing about the investments is you're making a prediction about the future, right? So if you are going to buy a new warehouse, set up a new factory, do this, you're not doing this because of conditions today. You're having to make a forecast about, first, well, that's actually a question. What time horizon do you need for this to pay off? And then what is it you're assuming? And what you've seen, that part of why I showed all those graphs, it's an extraordinarily difficult time to forecast. We don't have, lots of great examples of modern pandemics to look back on. So, oh, we're a late pandemic. We know what happens then. They don't. And you've actually seen, you read the business pages, you see stories of companies that get wrong-footed on this, and you can lose either way. You can either not invest enough, and then it turns out people really wanted your product and it's durable, that demand, and all of a sudden you're short and people can't find it and you're missing opportunities. But it goes the other way too, which is you ramp up production a lot and it turns out, well, that was just kind of a passing thing. That's why we were confined at home. Now we don't want this anymore. And all of a sudden you're left with lots and lots of stock that you can't sell. So Edwin's absolutely right. The investments are an event which should trigger a lot of questions like, why did you do this? What are you forecasting about demand? What do you think next year is going to look like? And when does this start to pay off for you? Over what time? So just an endorsement of both my fellow panelists.
So let's see, let's go to our first question from John Ariel Ndiso. How will Russia-Ukraine dispute disrupt China's global supply ecosystem? Any specific geopolitical scenarios?
I would say you've seen a certain coziness of late. This is not new. This is, diplomacy old school, going back to like the 1970s, where you sort of triangulation, different ones matching off. I think to the extent that Russia has been reallocating some of its gas supplies, it looks like it's been going to Asia. So I don't think that would likely have any direct negative effects on China. Indirectly, if you cause, China is dependent on Western demand. And so if you have something that ended up causing a shock to that, this would not really be to China's benefit. But the direct stuff is probably well, if the Europeans don't want our gas, here's all the more for you.
Edwin, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, and feel free to bounce ideas back, Phil or Danny, if you have thoughts on this too. But I think one thing that I know I'm watching, and sticking to the facts, there are two things that we know. One is, as Philip said, electronics, air cargo could see some indirect effect. A lot of electronics have semiconductors. Their semiconductors are in a very, 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 very tight supply right now. And so that's fact line number one. The second thing related to that is, one thing that we do know is, no matter how bad this gets, the US has threatened to put kind of a chokehold on the amount of semiconductors that Russia can receive from allied nations. The reason I bring this up is, this is entirely, speculation. We don't know this for a fact, but it's an area for investigation if that threat comes to fruition, right? Because one thing that I think often gets lost is, just as I was saying earlier about leadership, manufacturers, suppliers have to make a choice every day, every week, every month of which client they supply first. And a lot of semiconductor capacity suppliers are based out of China or China influence, locations. And so I think that's a story to watch, right? I have no idea how it'll actually play out. Nobody does. But I think it's really, really important to keep an eye, not just on, the overall cargo trend, but also those manufacturer choices. If something were to happen and the US threatens to cut off supply of semiconductors, that kind of splits, right? China is probably going to have to prioritize providing semiconductors to Russia. How will that affect the Teslas, the Apples of the world that are also getting materials from them? So that could be one direct effect, but again, nothing's guaranteed, nothing is concrete.
So Edwin, back to your advice for people who are new to covering the supply chains, and to Danny's advice to dig down. If you're in a local coverage area and you go to the manufacturer and you say, what's your bet? You're basically making a bet, right? If you're investing, what is the incentive of the source to talk to you? Is the source going to be giving away confidential information by basically revealing their market research or their decision making? And as journalists, how do we get around the problem of the people that we often most want to talk to don't want to tell us their business secrets? And especially in this era where forecasting, as Phil said, is so fraught and difficult.
Yeah, I'll answer that first by, I'm sure Danny has a lot of really good experience here, so I'd love to hear her thoughts. Just don't be afraid to ask. It's like the number one thing. Oftentimes we as journalists can be so caught up in that second question, which is to say, oh my gosh, are they going to answer this question? But what I found from experience, especially with the smaller suppliers, right, that new manufacturing plant, is they're more of a marketing agency than they're afraid of their competitive secrets being spilled. Now, this is if you're asking about their hopes and dreams and ambitions. If you go into a manufacturing plant and you ask them about how their machine works and how that's a competitive advantage, yeah, they're not going to tell you. But if you're asking them like, hey, what are you trying to achieve with this new facility? In order for that projection to come true, they also have to do a little bit of marketing and sales and get their name out there that they're building capacity so that their clients. So you'll be surprised. They actually have more incentive than you think to give you those type of answers. Tesla, Apple, different stories altogether when you're talking about the big companies there. But Danny, I don't know, I'm sure you have other advice and tips.
Yeah, I think you nailed it in that regards. Is I always say that, can you show me behind the scenes if that's possible? I really want our audience to really understand how certain things work, because I think that's another part of storytelling, right? Is actually whether you're writing it or talking about it, that is part of it. So if you're at a manufacturing place, you could be talking about the machinery, or you could be talking to the drivers, the warehouse workers as well. They also probably could tell you a lot on what's going on the day to day. So obviously the worker side's a little bit more difficult to tackle, but definitely, I mean, I think you nailed it in regards to, it is kind of a little bit of a marketing. So if you kind of say, oh, I would like to kind of see behind the scenes how this works, that's how I would approach it. Now, if they backfire, then obviously you got to be like, okay, well, I got to think of a plan B, but I would approach it in an easy way, especially when you have competitors. But like you said, manufacturing hubs, they're everywhere. I mean, they're popping up everywhere. So
we have a question from Orla O'Sullivan. In the US, do panelists see the West Coast, specifically the area around LA, as the most congested part of the supply chain?
The West Coast has been more congested, and you've seen things trying to, it's bigger. I mean, LA Long Beach is the number one entry point. You've seen this. You do get some equilibration. So people are actively trying to look to see where can I send stuff. One of the things we've seen in our data is you'll occasionally get an enthusiasm, which will be like, I know, let's all go to Oakland, and that'll just solve everything. We just run it all through Oakland. The interesting thing is, if you look at the kind of times we were doing for the ocean timeliness indicator, when you break that down by port, we don't publicly release that, but when you break it down by port, you see that at one point, 3 or 4 months ago, Oakland looked like the worst port of the West Coast for bringing things in. Then they got their act together and things were moving. Then for a while there, they look like the best. It's there's a lot of sort of looking around and exploring alternatives and seeing. And the hard part is, that indicator I was showing you where I said we're 110 days now, that's retrospective. And the problem is you have to plan this 110 days ago, which of these ports is going to be the best. And, I'm sure that my colleagues could maybe say more. There are real differences between ports. The thing I talk about, sort of make this real, is if you were thinking about, let's say you were flying to Washington, D.C., which airport do you fly into? Do you fly into Dulles or BWI or National? Well, it's a difference in terms of connecting and trying to get to where you want to go. And it is a bit the same for freight, that if you end up with the one that has all the sort of rail and trucking connections that you wanted, that's getting you there, life's a lot easier than if you go somewhere else and those connections are not as easy to make. So yes, West Coast has been bigger. You're getting people exploring partly because it's been delayed, also because there's concerns about West Coast labor negotiations.
Yeah, and to that point, Phil, I wanted to say one thing is I was reading in the news that port officials in Florida are pushing for cargo to go to Florida instead, right, to ease the supply chain. I haven't dug deep into that yet, but I do find that very interesting because it is around negotiations and things like that. So I didn't, obviously I don't have all the data, but I'm just interested to see if that would even be an option. Is that because
this is a great example of what you were talking about earlier, which is the get on the ground and ask, which is my assertion would be that companies have fairly lengthy checklists of what do they need to have their supply chain function well. And so, but what's on those checklists? Well, those are things one can ask about. Is it just processing time? Is it connection services for the companies that you're talking to, for the people at the ports? What is it that they're looking for, and what's involved if you make a switch from shipping, LA Long Beach into Florida? What does that mean you then have to do? Where are these goods going? Are they going to Kansas City? Are they going to Denver? What are you doing, and what's involved? And so I think you end up, just like you said, if you go down and you ask these questions, you find very interesting things, which is that it's not, which won't be obvious to those who are sort of theorizing from on high, that, what are the costs involved?
And to add really quickly, if I may, to what both Danny and Phil said, which is that from a high level, right, congestion is demand minus capacity, right? Which means, yes, LA Long Beach is incredibly congested right now, but they have also for the longest time handled the most goods out of all the ports. So if everyone decides today to go from LA Long Beach, and like 90% of companies move their supply chains and start shipping to Miami, right? That's going to be the most congested port because their capacity is way smaller. So I think what both Danny and Phil said is really important is, yes, people are trying these different things, but you can't look at congestion and as a net sum and be like, oh my gosh, LA is congested, right? You have to be looking at it port specific capacity as well.
Okay, we have a couple questions and comments about metals. There's already a shortage of certain metals to Europe, aluminum, iron, et cetera. China has a shortage, not to use your least favorite word, Edwin. But could anyone speak to the effect of metals, especially aluminum, if sanctions were to be imposed on Russia?
I definitely spoke with an analyst from Commonwealth, and I asked about this specifically because I did think it was interesting. So whoever brought that up, good question. So from what I'm understanding is that Russia supplies the key metals. And so if anything would happen, the impacts that they would say would be the prices of certain metals. And they did mention nickel. Nickel was one of them that would definitely be price. So, but that's all that we really dove into, and not only metals, but the other part was food. So harvest. They said several greens. That was what the analyst told me. Several greens would be impacted as well. So it's not just metals, but also greens. They said that for now, our harvest season is good, but if this continues through the spring, then we would really see some impact in food and prices. So that's from what I understood.
Fascinating. So Phil, back to your inflation point. We have a question from Gabriel Cortez, who was actually a National Press Foundation fellow in our data program earlier this year. He asks, what are you looking for in tomorrow's inflation report? And how do you think the Fed's first rate hike of the year will impact consumer demand? What other indicators will you be watching for the rest of Q1 and Q2? And I suspect, Danny, you'll have something to say about that as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The first thing I would note, there's a complication to this story, which is there's multiple inflation indicators out there. And the ones that we're going to be seeing next, the one that's sort of most visible, the consumer price index, is not the one the Fed relies on the most. And you've had a very striking divergence between these. So we've been having 7% inflation according to the CPI. If you look at the measure that the Fed tends to use, which is the trimmed mean personal consumption expenditure deflator, that's more like 3%. Now, they've all been trending up. So things I'm watching for, where are the trends going? And the theory that people had was that these price increases were sort of very localized. They were just in a few things. And that's why you have this trimmed mean idea, which is cut out the extremes. That's something the Dallas Fed puts out. So that's part of what you look for, is how widespread is this? And are you, in general on inflation, looking to see, is this getting into stuff that sort of forms expectations and gets embedded? So one of the theories that people had was, hey, look, this is mostly energy, this is used cars, that stuff will sort of come and then it'll go. And that was a lot of the rationale behind the transitory. So one of the things, and even though the Fed, Chairman Powell forswore the word transitory, if you still look at their inflation predictions, they're thinking transitory. And so that's a big question. That's why they've been reluctant to raise rates. It'll be interesting to watch. You've had this on the rate rises, you've had this sort of very gradual response on the part of the Fed, which has put them behind the curve, which is not where the Fed has generally wanted to be. And so I think you've got a reconciliation that has to take place between what markets are expecting, where they think things are kind of calm and this is a minor adjustment, to what have we seen in the past when you got behind the curve and you get embedded inflation. And then you're thinking about things like 1981, where you have to have very high interest rates to tamp the stuff down. I was admonishing everyone earlier, don't just look at the nominal, look at the real. All right, let's do that with the Fed funds rate for a second. Nominally, the Fed's funds rate has been hanging around zero. Even if you take their preferred measure of, something like the trimmed mean PCE deflator, that means that your real rate is somewhere between like -3, -4%. You got a long ways to go to get that to neutral. So to me, that's the big question, is that's still a gamble that they're still stepping on the gas. They're slightly letting up on the gas. The question is, are things going to slow on their own, or at some point are they going to really have to step on the brakes? And that will be a jolt. And what you watch in the meantime is what's happening with longer bonds, like the 10-year treasury, which has just started to go up a bit. That's usually more what's going to feed into consumers, because it will affect things like mortgage rates. Mortgage rates then affect, what I was talking before about buying ovens and sofas. Usually you want to have a place to put those, like a house. So, are people buying? Is this stuff happening? But there's a lot of expectations that are likely to shift. And so what's going to shift those? Whether people think things are transitory or not, is a big question.
Just to follow up on the impact on consumer demand, right? There's the sticker shock that people are experiencing in supermarkets, and then there's the question of whether if we've all bought our ovens and our cars and we've been home and we already have our Peloton and I don't need 2 Pelotons. How do you what advice would you be giving your clients or other reporters on this long-term 2022 demand curve? What do you see happening here?
Well, and that's the question. And that was the other big part of, the Fed, when they were they're fairly transparent. And in fact, I would recommend go read stuff that like Chairman Powell talks about. It's not a bunch of mathematical equations. He's actually laying out pretty clearly, here's our assumptions, here's what we think happening. We've seen a lot of durable stuff move up. Therefore, as you say, you won't need 2 exercise bikes. And so this is going to back off even without us doing much. That's, you saw in the graph that I showed, yes, we had durables easing off, but non-durables were going up. So there's a real question there about how the behavior goes. Some of this gets to be, did people sort of shift their behavior just for the pandemic? And we hope the pandemic is easing up. Or is this sort of the new thing that you've formed some new habits and that's what you're going to go do? You don't like going to the gym and you want to keep building out your home exercise area.
Go ahead, Danny.
Well, I was going to ask Phil, because this is the question that really just I keep going back to with the Fed and what they pay attention to in the data, and obviously the jobs report, right? You look at the jobs report and then you look at specifically the certain sectors, right? I think hospitality for unemployment rate was like 8% or something like that. So and then CPI is coming out on Friday, right? And so you look at the different data that the Fed is essentially looking at, right? And they're trying to navigate and be like, okay, when are we going to hike rates? I guess for me, it's always that kind of like, it seems like a mixed picture or like a lot of noise, per se, when it comes to the data. But I think that's the thing for me, that my biggest question is, what exactly are those numbers that they're really focusing on? Because obviously in the Fed speech, he kept saying there's a strong labor market. He kept saying that, our labor market is strong, but yet you talk to small business owners and they're still having a really hard time hiring. So, it just seems very contradicting at times.
Well, so when the Fed says a strong labor market, that's what they mean. It's that people who have a hard time hiring. So those parts are consistent. What I would say is the Fed has in mind, here's their problem. They're tasked with price stability and full employment. That's their statutory mandate. They're trying to say, for price stability, they have in mind that if you start pushing too close to an economy's capacity, prices will start going up. All right, so far so good, all simple. 2 big wrinkles to this. 1, we don't know what capacity is. And 2, they kind of have to be forecasting this 18 months in advance, because most of their measures only operate with what they refer to as long and variable lags. So that takes a fairly straightforward problem and makes it into a really difficult problem. And so I think what you're picking up is you see an employment report like the one we just had. Well, where does that tell us about where we are relative to capacity? So on the one hand, you look and you say, well, 4% unemployment, that's historically really quite low. And look, that's a lot of jobs. And especially if you look at the revisions for the last 2 months, that's a lot of job creation. But it leaves us short of where we were pre-pandemic. Is that the right measuring stick? Should we be getting back? And that's what they'll often cite, is like, well, look, we're millions of jobs short. but have people's behavior change? Have we had, women having to leave the labor force because they have undependable childcare? Are there people who decided to retire early? We've seen people talk about the Great Resignation, and you've seen sort of behavioral shifts. Or is this one of these things where you put money in people's pockets and so they took a break, but they're all going to come flooding back, and so you're not hitting the constraints of the economy? Everybody's going to come in and staff it all again, and you won't get wages pushed up. Wages, by the way, are a good indicator of these things. See how this stuff gets embedded, and when you have things like the John Deere strike and the other stuff, how does this get resolved? Does everybody say, "Oh, I see they're forecasting 3% inflation, so I'm very happy with a 3% raise"? Or do they say 5%? You're kidding me. That doesn't even cover my 7% inflation. That's part of what I was talking about earlier of how these things get embedded. And as far as I've seen, it's looking like we're getting inflation embedded.
Well, thank you all for a fascinating conversation. Philip Levy, Edwin Lopez, and Danny Romero, thank you. Everything will be posted online at nationalpress.org. And I'm so grateful to all of you for your time and expertise.